Hey, hello there. Welcome to Travels with Geordie. If this is your first visit, my name is Peter and I live on this old wooden cruiser here in Victoria, British Columbia, Canada with my dog Geordie, thus Travels with Geordie. Now the truth is we're not traveling much these days. We're mostly staying put while we restore the boat while we live aboard. It's a bit of a project. If it's the kind of thing you might be interested in, pull up a chair and subscribe. We'd love to have you along. I should also mention that I give away a Travels with Geordie t-shirt. With every episode you can find out how in the description below. This week we'll be advancing my friend's boat, Zephyrus, which if you've been following along you'll know that we've been doing quite a bit of work to. And in this episode we finally button up the engine, get it installed permanently, all aligned and fitting properly. Not started yet, that's coming up soon. Stay tuned. Cheers! This time we're working on the engine. It's been a while since we've been able to do anything on the engine because we've been waiting for some parts. Mostly we've been waiting for some new transmission brackets to have fabricated up. I can't say I'm thrilled with these, more on that in a bit, but they're made and we'll see how we can do with that. The reason I needed new mounts, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to put you in a tripod so you don't have to shake around like everything. But hang on a second here. Okay, so I mentioned made up some new brackets for the transmission, and the reason I did that is because the old ones, they're gnarly of course, but not only that, they're on a significant angle. If you see the angle between the face of the transmission and the face of the engine bed is about, oh I don't know, 95 or 100 degrees. That's because to get the old Perkins 6 in, they had to tip the whole arrangement over more than its natural tilt, which means they had to tip the transmission over and make custom brackets to do it. They were kind of ugly and gnarly. Now that we're putting the regular, proper upright engine back in, we're all set and we don't have to worry about that. And have a set of 4 new proper engine mounts instead of, well, there were no engine mounts at all in this. It was hard bolted to the engine beds, thus being so darn noisy. I will take you off there for a second because I want to show you what I'm having to dig away with down here. I'm sure the camera won't pick up quick enough, but down here where the engine mounts were, there's a great big piece of channel iron and a couple of bolts sticking through it that's bolted through to the engine beds. Way overkill. It's got to come off and I'm having a terrible time getting it off. I just got this one off just a second and it's a beast. Bit of spruce under there as a spacer. Kind of ugly. So we'll get rid of that. And I'll keep working on the back. But let me show you what I'm going to do up front first. Okay, again, the engine beds, like in my boat, are too high for the standard mounts. Well, here's the standard front mount for the Perkins engine. 4 bolts onto the side of the Perkins, and there's the hole for the engine mount. The only problem is these are too low, or in other words, the engine beds are too high for it. Can't sit low enough. So I'm taking them off and putting them on upside down. Gives me about 4 inches more clearance, and the engine mounts, these puppies here, will basically go up inside it like that instead of like that. I think you get the picture. Let me just get some of this done. I can show you how it goes. Cheers. See if I can pry these buggers off. Oh man. Okay. More junk. So what I'm doing here is just cleaning out the threaded holes in the side of the transmission because I want to make sure that these 6 bolts, actually 6 on each side, have the cleanest possible threads because they're going to be pretty tight and they were pretty full of rust and gunge. So I've chased out all the threads on both sides, which correspond to those 6 holes. So these babies go right there, and that's what I'm going to do now. Get them on there and see how well these motor mounts work out. So I've got all the mounts on, brackets on, and the rubber isolation mounts on as well. So here's the new transmission bracket and a rubber isolation mount. Same the other side. If you look down here, this miserable one, which just clears the raw water pump, is in loose so that I can adjust it, as is this one down here. Again, I'm not sure you're seeing any of that. Okay, so now it's the process of lowering it down, seeing how well I can line it up with the propeller shaft, do some adjustments, do some tweakings, and see if my calculations are correct. There may be more swearing. Let's see. None of the come-alongs are in exactly the right place. I have to shove the engine around and jam it with my feet as it goes up and down praying nothing lets go and crushes my feet. Okay, let's take this down a bit. This may be the last come along operation in the whole set of projects, and wouldn't that make me happy? And okay then, so you've been spared a fair amount of cursing. It's in. There it is. From the start, you know, I was worried that it was even going to fit. Well, either it was going to be too low and it was going to be basically sitting in the bilge, or it was going to be too high and it wouldn't fit under the sole. Because the previous engine had been a Perkins 6 lay down horizontal, it was very hard to do the calculation to figure out exactly where it was going to sit. Right now I've got it sitting where I'm very happy with the droop on the drive shaft, prop shaft. I don't know if I already talked about this, but basically the propeller shaft is hanging, sorry about the bilge pump, was hanging in the air about 5 feet from the gland, so it sags a little bit when it's not connected to anything. Maybe 1/4 of an inch, maybe 3/8 of an inch, very hard to tell. So I figured I could lift it and drop it about 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch. So I said I'm going to lift it about 1/4 for its natural state. In other words, not drooping, being dead straight. It's kind of a dark art, and I'm certainly no expert at it. So I've got basically the transmission and the engine all lined up. I don't know if you can see down there the new motor mounts. So it was really easy to just tweak up and down the mounts to get the back up and the front up. Basically what I did is I bolted together the bottom of the flange between the transmission and the propeller shaft, and there's obviously a gap at the top of the flange. You need a picture for this, I'm sure. And as I lift the front of the engine, it slowly closes that until it just touches and I can't get a 2 thou feeler gauge in anymore. It's a little complicated because the mounts for the transmission are slightly forward of the flange, so as I'm tipping the front of the engine up, the tail piece, in other words the flange, is actually dropping slightly, so it's changing my 1/4 inch droop and stuff like that. So all in all, it took a little while, but I've got it where I want it. Now comes the dirty part. The rocker cover is 1/4 inch higher than the bottom of the fold down sole hatch. Well, that didn't bother me much because I can carve this out, because this is actually made of 2 pieces of 3/4 inch plywood. It's a bit extreme, so it's nothing for me to notch out a little of that. I knew the header tank was going to be a problem because of the radiator cap, which is obscenely high. I don't know why it has to be so bloody high. Well, I know why it has to be high, because it has to be the highest thing in the cooling system. Well, the top surface of this radiator cap is exactly 1.5 inches higher than the bottom of the sole plywood, which means it's the entire thickness of the plywood. So if I cut a hole right through it, close the hatch, this will be completely flush with the top of the sole. Well, that's not bad. Just throw a carpet down over it, no one will even notice. It was a tight fit, folks. It was a really tight fit. And mine might be worse. Anyway, it's in. It's mostly lined up. What I haven't done yet is drilled holes for the mounts into the engine beds. So that's for tomorrow. I think it's dream time, really. It's been a great day. Cheers. Well, hey there, welcome back to Travels with Geordie. I'm just making up some blocks out of mahogany, out of Sapele mahogany, for the motor mounts for the engine in MV Zephyrus. I think if you followed along, you know that I flipped over the mounts on the engine, and I had some raised mounts made for the transmission so that the mounts on the engine and the transmission could be high enough that I could put in proper vibration reducing traditional motor mounts for engines for boats, because originally the engine in this had been bolted directly to the engine beds. Kind of a high vibration and noise situation. So by flipping it over, that was great. They gave me enough clearance, but it was actually a bit too high. So in the transmission end, I have to put 3/4 inch spacer blocks, which are going to be these 2 pieces of Sapele. And at the engine end, I actually need 3 3/4 inch blocks. I have to raise it about 1.25 inches. A little more than that. Sorry, that'd be 1.5 inches, 2 1/4. And so I just cut these bits of Sapele, which I'm going to glue together, and then pre-drill for the 4-inch spacing for the motor mounts. That'll give me another advantage. That'll be much easier for me to locate the holes in the engine beds, because I can also slide these around with these holes already in these blocks, and then screw them down temporarily, remove the engine mount, and then drill right through into the engine beds for the big lag bolts. Anyway, you'll see how I'm doing all that in a bit. Right now I'm just going to glue these together. It's not that these have to be terrifically strong. I'm going to use Gorilla Glue, urethane glue. but it'll resist shear a little bit, because the thread here is the thrust from the engine pushing forward, pushes the motor mounts forward, and I don't want these sliding against each other and racking the bolts that are holding it to the engine bolt. So I want this to be a very secure, solid block. Anyway, not very exciting. Gluing wood together. Cheers! Urethane glue is amazing stuff. Incredibly strong. Not necessarily a marine product, but I know it's going to be plenty strong for what I'm doing. And incredibly water stable over time. It's miserable to work with though, because it's thick as anything, especially when it gets a little bit old. There we go. Don't need a lot, because it's just going to foam out over the edges if I put too much in here anyway. I gave these blocks a bit of a sanding, just a tiny tidy up. It just seems such a shame to be using mahogany and not making it at least reasonably pretty. I'm going to let those sit for a bit, come and check them again in a few minutes before they harden right up. And before long, they will be bulletproof with foamed up glue coming around the corner. Okay, so we check on some of this glue. Yeah, it's foaming up nicely. That's after about, I don't know, half an hour or so. But it looked like that pretty much in about 5-10 minutes. And that's still a little bit sticky, but there's no way you could get that apart. Now, I'll let it be for just a little bit longer, because I'm going to do some final confirmations on the alignment for the propeller shaft. Now, let's do a tour here. I don't remember if you've been down here before, but anyway, this is a propeller shaft. It goes back to the propeller. Right about here, I can't lift it because it's underneath that cabinet, is the gland. So the propeller shaft from the gland, in other words, the stuffing box, forward, right now is suspended. And it's about 4.5, maybe 5 feet. And if you look in there, you can see, I'll change hands here, this is the drive flange on the propeller shaft, and that's the drive flange on the back of the transmission. I've just disconnected them. So there's about a 1/4 inch gap between, so they can move in relation to each other. You can see I'm wiggling the propeller shaft, the transmission is not moving. Right now you can see that the propeller shaft is about a 1/4 inch lower than the transmission. And that's because of this sag that I'm talking about. In other words, when I had it connected, it was being held up about a 1/4 inch. So I'm having to guess how much sag there is in this right now. Again, it's about 1.25 inch stainless steel shaft. It's sticking out about 4.5, 5 feet. It's got a pretty heavy casting on the end. So, but at the same time, it's also pretty strong. So you'd think it could stay relatively straight over that length. But I'm pretty sure it sagged about 3/16 to 1/4 inch. So I'm going to settle on a 1/4. Of course, there's going to be a sea trial that guarantees it runs smoothly, but I'm going to lift it that 1/4, just as I already have. The engine's in exactly the right place right now. I wanted to confirm that I wasn't pushing the propeller shaft left or right. I've put a mark here with a square down to the side of the shaft, and it didn't move at all when I took the transmission off. So everything is really nicely lined up right now. There may be just a slight adjustment in terms of moving the engine around a bit when it gets bolted up the final time, which I'll do with the feeler gauges. Way more than you want to know now. Okay, so it's time to actually bolt the engine down for the final time using my new wooden blocks, which I'm making, instead of those bits of strapping that are down there. Okay, I'm sure this is incredibly entertaining. Wood blocks, let's get them. Well, this is going to be a fairly lengthy process. I'm going to start with the aft ones, the transmission ones, because they're not laminated up, they're just a single piece of mahogany. And they're going to go down and replace, you can just see that piece of strapping, and on the other side you might be able to see another piece of strapping, 3/4 inch, same deal. But this is going to take a while, because I'm going to have to remove the mount from one corner at a time, because I don't want to risk moving the engine at all. Slide this under, make sure everything is in alignment properly, and then take the mount off completely, take it up here, and then drill the 4-inch, I believe, spacing, reset it, put it back in place, and then put a couple of temporary screws to hold it in place, and then take the whole mount off the transmission so I can get a big 1/2 inch drill down to drill out the engine beds, because I can't quite get a drill past into that hole past this mount. It's not that I wasn't thinking, there was no other way to make that, but it would have been really nice if I could have done that. Okay, come on, let's just do it. Here we go. So I've got one of the engine mounts out, and I've got it clamped to both rear beds, or bed extensions, whatever we're calling this block. So I'm going to drill out both of them at the same time, 1/2 inch drill. Just use this for the guide. And down we go. There we go. One side. Now what I'm going to do, the other side is a slot, and I don't want to drill through a slot. So I'm going to take a bolt. The reason I don't want to drill through a slot is because the drill could wander a bit and not give me a nice square hole. So what I'm going to do is at least line it up with a bolt back down through there, so I know that's in alignment. Square this up, square this up. Okay, so it's time to put the rear ones on. One done. Two. So I didn't show you too much about putting the rear blocks in, basically because it's pretty mundane. There's not much light down there, and I didn't think it was all that interesting. So now I'm moving on to doing the front ones, which are these triple stacks, which are going to replace those 3 pieces of strapping under the mounts you see down there. And so it's the same detail. I have a huge advantage at the front in that I don't have to remove the mounts off the engine, which I did in the back. It's kind of hard to see, but in other words, to be able to drill the main holes right down there and right down there, I can drill them with a great big long 3/8 drill bit I have, which is relatively appropriate for a 1/2 inch lag bolt. Anyway, you'll see what I mean. It's going to be a lot easier on the front. Okay, so to begin with, to get this strapping out, I'm going to take a little pressure off by lifting the engine a little bit, but I don't want to move it. Just take a little tension off. And then I can take this mount out, use my special modified cutoff engine mount adjustment tool, and run that nut down. So there's the 3 temporary blocks which I'm replacing, and put in one of these babies. First, make sure that engine bed is nice and smooth. Good. That's it, right there. So I've got the blocks both sides set in exactly the place I want them. I've put a little pressure on them so that they're held in place pretty well. Now I'm going to drill out the engine bed with this nice long drill. I put a little flag on here. These lags are 8 inches long, so I want to make sure I have enough clearance. Now this is a 3/8, which is a little bit small for a 1/2 inch lag, but the wood is Douglas fir, I believe. It drills relatively easily, and certainly with the short 4-inch lags I put on the transmission end, that felt really good. However, I'm going to put 5 or 6 inches of lag into this engine bed, so it might get pretty tight by the time I get down there, and I might need to open up the hole just a little bit. You say, why such massive bolts, Peter? But bear in mind that the entire force of the forward and, for this that matter, reverse thrust of the engine is transferred from the propeller to the propeller shaft to the transmission to the mounts, both the rear and front mounts. So the entire force of the engine is pushing over on this. So if you imagine this only a couple of inches into the engine bed, and then those tall blocks I have, which are pretty stiff, but they're still not directly connected to the engine bed, that force is pushing with quite a long lever arm. So I want as much of this bolt in the engine bed as possible to create lots of shear, because over time there's going to be vibration, there's going to be loads, shock loads. I don't want that to start getting soft in that Douglas fir and have the engine start to move around. No harm. They're 6-inch, actually they're 7 and change deep beds, so this still doesn't go all the way through. Anyway, let's see how we do. Easy peasy. And that's all the way down. I'm going to go do the other side. You don't need to watch. There we go. By having the gantry still here, I just lifted the engine up and over, and I'm completely clear to be able to put these in now. So I'm going to just wind them through temporarily. Okay, that is bulletproof. Okay, let's do the other side. I'll check in with you later.